Welcome to Ladies Talking Love Season 3, Episode 8, What You Didn't Know About the Sexual Response Cycle. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. Well, hello, friends. It's been a minute. I had a baby girl. We're both doing really great. And it was really good to just take some time to decompress and breathe and relax and try to heal. And relax as much as a mother of 4 can. But I'm so glad to be back and that we can jump back into season 3. I hope that this episode will be a good kickoff. I get to have such a great guest on, and we're going to dive deep into the sexual response cycle. And I really hope that this episode gives you a lot of great things to talk about and think about with your spouse, because there is so much information and so many hard myths and hurtful things that come from our misunderstanding of the sexual response cycle, specifically for women, because a lot of us have viewed the sexual response cycle in a certain way. And when we don't fit it, we may feel like we can't get aroused, or we can't feel desire, or that something's wrong with us because we're not having the same type of sexual response that we think is normal. So I hope that this episode is really helpful for you to kind of dig into those myths and talk about with your partner what is actually going on for both of you and what's your reality, and bring so much more compassion and understanding to the relationship, because you better understand where you're both coming from. Dr. Sheva Marcus is a certified sex therapist and the author of Sex Points, Reclaim Your Sex Life with the Revolutionary Multi-Point System. She has spent her life helping women reclaim pleasure in their bodies and spirit, and her career has been dedicated to bridging the gap between the medical and the psychological in women's sexual health. For nearly 25 years, she served as the clinical director of one of the largest sexual health centers in the U.S. Dr. Marcus earned a master's in public health as well as a PhD in human sexuality at the Institute for the Advanced Study of Human Sexuality. She also holds master's degrees in social work from Columbia University and a Jewish studies from the Jewish Theological Seminary. She is also a certified bariatric counselor. Before jumping in, I just wanted to let you know that I'm here for you and I see you. It took me so long, and still is a struggle sometimes, to talk about my sexual relationship with my partner. It's such a vulnerable space and can be really hard, especially if you're new at it and just starting the conversation. And so I created 10 conversation starter questions to help you start the conversation about sex with your partner. I hope for those of you that are maybe struggling to start that conversation, that this can be an easy segue to start asking questions about what you both expect in your sex life and what you're hoping for your sexual encounters to be like. I've linked the download in the show notes. It's free, so please go ahead and download that. And I hope that it's a great chance for you and your partner to open up that conversation and to start working on making this a beautiful part of your relationship. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Sheva Marcus onto Ladies Talking Love today. Thanks so much for joining me.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to have another fantastic educator. She's a great follow on Instagram, but I love learning from you, Sheva. It's so fun to just follow along. And one thing I wanted to talk with you about today is the sexual response cycle.
That yes, I feel like that's
right,
right. Yes. Okay.
What is it? What do people mean when they say sexual response cycle?
That's a more complicated question than you may know, but let me start by saying this. Classically, for the last 100 years or so, sex therapists, everybody, the whole world sort of was going along what they thought was the classic sexual response cycle, which was developed by Masters and Johnson. People might have heard of Masters and Johnson. There was a TV show that was made about them recently, like a couple of years ago. they developed a sexual response cycle that said, here's how people's sexual activity and response tends to function. And this is what they said. First, you have desire, like you want to have sex. And then when you have sexual desire, you then integrate sexual stimuluses that get you turned on. So you start kissing your partner, thinking about your partner, touching your partner, then you get turned on. So first there's desire, then there's arousal. And then if the arousal gets to be enough and you have the right kind of arousal for long enough, it leads to orgasm, which is like the culmination. And then you go back to your standard way of being. And then if the desire kicks in again, you then want to have sex again. That was the sexual response cycle that people lived by, the Bible of sexual response cycle for many, many years, until about maybe 20 years ago, when an OBGYN in Vancouver said, you know what? That actually does not reflect most of the women that I know.
At all.
At all. And then, right, exactly. She said, that sounds like a classic male sexual desire cycle. And the truth is, not wanting to put down Masters and Johnson, it was the first time anybody had tried to sort of articulate a sexual response cycle. So I think it wasn't a bad first try because it makes sense cognitively.
Yeah.
But it doesn't reflect most women's experience. And honestly, I'm not even sure it reflects a lot of men's experience. So we can talk about that, but for sure for women.
Yep.
So what did Rosemary Bassan say? She said, I think of this more as a circle. She said, women usually make some kind of decision that they want to have sex. I want to have sex because it will make me feel close to my partner. I want to have sex because the orgasm will feel good. I want to have sex because it's been 3 days since we had sex, right? Or 3 weeks since we had sex. I want to have sex because my partner wants to have sex. I want to have sex because it will make me feel relaxed. I want to have sex because it'll just make me happier. It gives me endorphins.
I want to have a baby.
Yeah, okay. I want to have a baby. I didn't even throw that one in. Okay. That one's sort of a little less common because if we only did it when we want to have a baby,
True.
we'd have a lot. But yes, I want it. Yes, no, because you see that when women are trying to get pregnant, their desire, quote unquote, goes up dramatically. So the decision gets made before there's any physical feeling of desire. Then in that situation, if they decide they want to have sex, they introduce or we introduce all those stimuluses that get us turned on. So we'll think of like past sexual activity that was like really turned us on, or we start kissing our partner, or we start touching our partner, all the things that could turn us on until we get turned on. So the arousal is actually coming before the desire. And when the arousal comes in, when we start feeling the arousal, if you have good arousal, all of a sudden now you have some desire to have sex. And then you introduce more stimuluses and there's more arousal and then there's more desire. And so the desire and the arousal are feeding off each other. And then assuming all goes well and you have an orgasm or whatever it was your desired outcome is, most people like having orgasms. If at the end of the sexual activity, you've achieved that thing that you wanted, then the experience is a good experience. And then you will want to start that cycle again at some point. Does that sound clear? Like, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
It did to me. And I love like the way Emily Nagoski talks about it with responsive desire. So many women are like, I don't have desire. And I'm like, no, you do. It's just different. That's what we talk about is Masters and Johnson. We just talk about this cycle that, like you said, doesn't really fit most of us.
I'll tell you what really throws people off here, Ariel, is that early in our relationship, very early on, either when we're younger because our hormones are raging, which we'll get back to in a minute, or because newness in a relationship has a certain desired effect on you. The desire sometimes kicks in spontaneously at that point. So people start thinking that that's how it should be. But the truth is that is the unusual situation. Mm-hmm. And more common is this ability to get yourself turned on when you decide you want to, and then having the turn on this, have you the desire kicked in. And people call it responsive desire. I'm always a little shaky with that term because I feel like it's responsive to the stimuluses, but the stimuluses you introduced because you wanted them.
Yes,
so that was
totally,
you aren't initiating the whole thing because you're making yourself okay.
Which I love that you brought up about the decision, because I think that is so much for women. It's like, oh, yeah, I could have sex today. And that's when it starts. It's not just this bing.
Exactly. Like magic pixie dust.
Yeah.
It's so amazing to me that there are still women out there who somehow think, oh, I should only have sex when I'm like coming home from work, dripping with sweat, schlepping, 3 bags of groceries and having the kids whining. And I think that magic pixie dust of desire is just going to come floating down. It's
just going to fall on me.
And I'm like, okay, really? Now, yes, if you were 19 years old and had no responsibilities and met this new hot person, then yes, it may. But the expression of sort of spontaneous versus responsive is a useful one. But I do feel like when you say responsive, it doesn't necessarily responsive to another person. It could be responsive to your own psychological thinking. And I think like it's such a relief to so many women when they hear that.
Yes. And I'm so glad that you brought up too about when you're younger and maybe you start a relationship, especially in religious cultures where maybe we wait to have sex until we get married. I think a lot of us probably experience what we would say is spontaneous desire, just like, oh, I want to be intimate with my person. And then you get married. And I know a lot of women who are like, well, I don't have desire anymore. And I think it's because a lot of us experienced spontaneous, which is what everyone thinks is the norm. And so when we don't have that, we think we don't have desire.
So I want to say two things in response. One is, you know how when you see two 17-year-olds who are like climbing all over each other, they just started dating. Your first thought is not, they must have had a deep, intimate conversation, right? Your first thought is their hormones are raging.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you're 35 or 33 and you just had baby number one or baby number two, your hormones are at a completely different place. And then nobody gives any reality to that hormone. Like people are like, oh, it must be the relationship. And that makes me crazy because the hormones have such an important piece of that. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that people who are in religious communities, and I come from a Jewish Orthodox community, so many of the same issues, we blame things on, oh, it's early on, it's our first relationship, we never had sex before. That's true. But I will say that there are studies that show that there are hormone jumps whenever you start a new relationship. So when I deal with completely secular women who are on relationship number 3 or 4 or 10, and they're in a brand new relationship, it's a combination of, I do think there's dramatic hormone shifts. It's like a heady rush cocktail of estrogen and testosterone jumping, and the mystery and the unknown and the scariness of it a little bit, ironically, is very erotic, which is why I'm going a little off a tangent. Is that okay?
That is totally fine.
I often have like women who've been married for, 5 years or 10 years or whatever. And they're like, oh, I couldn't do that. Like I suggest something new. And they're like, oh, I feel too uncomfortable trying a new position or trying a costume, or it would make me feel so uncomfortable. And I don't want to feel uncomfortable. I need to feel comfortable. And I'm like, no, you don't. If you're feeling uncomfortable, you know that you are heading in the right direction.
Yep.
Early on sex is a little bit scary and it's a little bit unknown. There's a balance, right? You don't want to be in a really scary situation, but early on, you don't know what your partner's response is going to be. You don't know how they're going to see you. And it's that nervousness, that flutters in the stomach that really often create what's so erotic.
Yeah.
So this idea that my relationship should be 100% comfortable flannel pajamas is very unerotic, Anyway,
yes.
So when you're talking about the sexual response cycle, I know I got a little far afield here, but I think that is sort of important to keep in mind.
It is. And we're going to come back to that. I'm going to bring that back up at the end. As we've talked about kind of the Masters and Johnson false view we all have grown up with, which is crazy that 20 years ago, what was the doctor's name?
Oh, Rosemary Basson?
Yeah, Rosemary Basson. But so interesting that I think a lot of us are still getting the Masters and Johnson. And that's what...
Because it's very male-centered.
Yes.
It's very male-centered. And, I don't know if you have show notes, but if you Google Rosemary Basson, her response cycle is, or anybody who's listening can just Google Rosemary Basson response cycle. And there's a million charts and graphs that'll show it to you in a way that just makes it, I know it's like such a relief for so many women.
Yes, I will definitely link that in the show notes because I love that. Make the decision and then the arousal is what's going to bring the desire and they play off of each other. So as we're kind of breaking through these myths that we've grown up with, why would you say then is it important for us? You just mentioned a little bit of it, but I want to hear more. Like, why is it important to understand these common myths about the sexual response cycle?
It plays into a lot of different factors. So one is something that I talk about a lot, both in my book and in general when I'm speaking, is this idea that somehow you learn how to have sex, and then that's the way you have sex for the rest of your life. Sex is not static. Equivalent of if you started exercising when you were 15 years old or 18 years old, and you think you're a gymnast, and you think you're going to have the same routine then as you do when you are 28 and 38 and 48 and 58. That's absurd. At some point, your knees are not going to be able to handle it, or you don't like doing it anymore. You want to try something different, or your time, the amount of time you're putting in is different. Right? Our sex life changes all the time because of chemistry, our biological makeup, our relationships, our life status, our ability to tap into our sexual brain. Our bodies are constantly changing. Our sex life is constantly changing. Our relationships are constantly changing. And the more we understand that our sex life is going to be shifting and changing over the years, when something comes up that makes it not work, quote unquote, or different, or, something that we always did that we went to isn't sort of working anymore. It shatters us unless we understand that our sex life is a living, breathing, moving activity. I don't know, I was like, and that there's almost always a solution, but you have to understand that things are going to be different than they were yesterday. And so when it comes to the sexual response cycle, again, you and I started talking about that. If you think that all through your life, this magic pixie dust is going to settle on you, and that's when you're going to have sex, you're going to have very little sex. And sex tends to work it becomes cyclical. Once you stop having sex, it's almost harder. And we can talk about why that is also, like what's happening in your brain and what's happening in your body. But if you stop having sex for a while, it's much harder to start again. So ironically, the people who make the decision to have sex, and I need to separate out, Ariel, this is not like I really, really don't want to have sex. I'm aversive and I'm dragging myself to do it. That's a completely different story, and we can discuss that. But
we need therapy or some other help with that.
Exactly. There could be, you could maybe look at your hormones, you could look at therapy, that's good. But there's a very big difference. So let me talk about my ranking. I have this ranking thing, which I do with my women, which I think really helps make this sort of come alive a little bit. A 1 rank, a desire 1 is like that 18-year-old at the movie theater. She doesn't have to think about sex. She wants to have sex. She wants to have a lot of sex. She wants to have sex often with lots of different people, right? Or not, or one person. She wants to have a lot of sex. It's very spontaneous. Level 2 is exactly what we just discussed, which is that when and if you decide you want to have sex for any number of reasons, you can pretty easily get yourself in the mood. When I'm working with women, if I can get them, and I pretty much can always get women to that level.
That's great.
Assuming, the medications, the hormones aren't getting in the way too much. A level 2 is a great place to be.
Yeah.
And it's a great place to stay for a long-term monogamous relationship. That is a great place to be. And you have to work to stay at the 2. Yeah. But if you can be at the 2, that's our goal. Our goal is not to get you to a 1. I mean, it's lovely if we can get people to a 1, but that isn't my goal.
No, because I feel like that's not real life.
But I have kind of good news for you as a woman who's older, like I'm 61 and I have my children are in the house, I have grandchildren. And I feel like some of that comes back sometimes, but only if you, but only if you have kept sex in your life.
Yeah.
Right. If sex is out of your life, then it makes it much harder. But the freedom, all the things I just said, I don't usually have schlepping groceries home with 3 kids chasing me. It's a different world. That's not to say that my desire is always spontaneous, but I feel like women, when they get a little more space to breathe in their life, can somehow reclaim some of that. And that's a really nice thing for people to know.
Yeah.
So a level 3 is, and people probably recognize themselves, when you're kind of a little bit avoidant. You try to stay on your computer late when he goes to bed because you kind of want to hope that maybe he's asleep before you get up there, or you spend a lot of time in the shower, hoping, like you just kind of don't want to go there. And a 4 is like you're aversive. I've had women come to my office crying, saying, we haven't had sex in months. It's destroying my marriage. I love this person and I don't know what to do, but I cannot drag myself to have sex. So I would say to you, if you're listening to this, usually when you're hitting a low 3 and a 4, there's often other things at play, hormones, things like that. But really, if we get you a 2, if we can get a woman to a place where, I can get in the mood to have sex most of the time, not every time, but most of the time. And I can decide myself and I can decide because it's important to somebody else. That is amazing. Yeah. And I feel like this myth that we should all be walking around as a 1 all the time is just so unhelpful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like that was life-changing for me to realize spontaneous desire is not the norm. I can decide I'd like to have sex and then I can get there. That's a great place to be.
Exactly. That is a 2, and a 2 will take you through your life. And if you're at a 2, sometimes you might slide into a 3. You may even sometimes slide into 4 and need help. But the myth of the 1 is just not helpful.
Not helpful at all. And I'd love if you could walk us through a little bit a sexual response cycle look like for men. And of course, there's variation in men too.
Correct.
There's variation in men and women.
Totally. So I would say that the Masters-Johnson response cycle is actually not terrible for men. It's actually not bad. Men seem to have more spontaneous desire than women. Their testosterone levels are way higher. Men have 10 times the testosterone levels for women. I'm going to put in a little plug here. I think women pay no attention to the fact that they have testosterone. Like women, we think of ourselves as estrogen machines. Estrogen, because that's what we need for birth control. We have to manage that and gets our eggs out and gets, lactation happening. So that's how we can nurse. And women think of estrogen, estrogen, estrogen. Women have testosterone. And it's really important for the sexual response, we've discovered and we understand. Men have 10 times as much estrogen. And I think that is what often maybe manages the spontaneous sexual desire. So you will find men with spontaneous desire who just seem to want to have sex. And women will often be like, I don't understand. Our life is falling apart and everything seems to be going wrong. And yet he still wants to have sex. So I have a lot of thoughts about why that is. I do think a lot of that is hormonal. I think the other thing is, this, I do not have data. I usually don't like to say things unless I have data to back it up. But in this case, I feel pretty strongly about this is the case. When I see couples, then I just get the perspectives. Women will often talk about needing to feel connected in order to have sex. And men will often talk about having sex in order to feel connected. Now, women also do feel much more connected when they're having sex. There's no question. But men, when you get two women together, often women friends will talk. They hang out together and they'll talk, and that's what makes them feel close. And often with men, and I don't want to stereotype, but in general, men tend to do things together. They go play basketball, fishing, they go bowling, whatever it is they do, go to prayer services. Our community, that's a big deal. So they need to do something with their partner often to feel connected. And in a lot of cases, the sex is what makes them feel close and connected to their wives. So what happens is when the sex sort of falls off the table, women will be like, why is he kind of nagging me about the sex? But for the men, it's not just the physical release. These men often just feel so despondent and so separate from their wives. I do think sometimes what we think of as spontaneous desire may be a reaction to like, I want to feel close to my partner. So they will turn to sex, whereas women maybe don't turn to sex as easily. I don't know. Does that resonate with you at all? What do you think of that, Ariel?
I think I can see that. I don't like people being like, women want connection, men want sex. But the way you explained it, I feel like men do like to do things and women may like to talk. And I could see that men may be like, oh, sex is what I understand I could do to connect versus maybe some other activities. That's the thing that would be easy.
For sure. And I did not mean, so I want to be very clear. I am so opposed to the idea women want romance and connection and men want sex. That is not at all what I'm saying. So if it came across that way, I'm so happy that you're clarifying. What I'm saying is that women want sex. I think they want sex because they like sex. And that's a great, amazing thing. And sex makes women feel connected. But I don't know that women would jump at sex as the first way to get connected to their partner, whereas men might see it as their only avenue to feel connected to their partner. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many women will come in and say something like, when we're having sex and he leaves his socks on the floor, I will laugh, I will scoop up the socks and I will throw them in a hamper. When we haven't had sex in a while and he leaves his socks on the floor, I want to take those socks and I want to stuff them in his mouth. Sex does something in the relationship. It is a connector for both people. Like I'll often say, I didn't go into this field because I love so much explaining and working on how body part A fits in body part B. That is like not that interesting. I mean, it is interesting, but it's not that interesting. What I'm passionate about is how sex impacts. And by sex, I don't mean intercourse. I mean, all kinds of sex, how that impacts on the individuals, their feelings about themselves and their body and their relationship. That is what's really powerful. Yeah. But I do feel like women will sometimes say, I don't understand how our lives could be falling apart and he still wants to have sex.
But I can totally see that this is my avenue to access connection because it's something I can do. We don't have to leave the house.
Yes. And this could be cultural. They're not going to climb on the sofa and say, I just need to snuggle with you. I need you to hold me. It would be great if they could, but that's not how they work. We haven't taught them to do that. I don't know if they're testosterone. I don't know. Their way of saying, I want to be held and cuddled is sometimes I want to have sex with you. And I think if women understand that, it stops feeling like they're just trying to get off, which is a terrible feling for women because then they feel like
they're just trying to use me. This is just for them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Instead of realizing like, oh, my person wants to connect with me.
He's lonely and scared and also falling apart. And this is his way of connecting with me.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I think when we realize that too, and then can discuss it with our spouse and figure out like, okay, so you want to connect sexually. Can we first snuggle or can we first talk? Because I need that as well. And I just think that's such a beautiful thing to uncover. Give me a back rub first.
Yes.
Do the dishes.
Yes.
Put the kids to bed.
Let me take a hot bath.
Yes.
Exactly.
And I'm glad we kind of dug in a little more to kind of flesh that out because I think that's such an important thing to understand. And that's one thing I'm really passionate about. I think oftentimes our views as women about our husband make sex feel like we're being used or it's just about them getting off instead of realizing our husband wants to connect and wants to show love.
I think I have so much empathy for the men because I feel like they've really gotten a raw deal in a lot of popular culture now. And I just feel like if they want to have sex with you, something else is going on. And you should try to appreciate that before you get so angry at them and then negotiate it.
Yeah, so glad that you talked about that, because understanding that and understanding those response cycles, I think can really help women. Like you said, okay, I realize you want to connect. Give me some time because now I can decide and make that decision if I want to, and then get in the mood,
Totally. Exactly. And for some women, getting in the mood might be the back rub or them doing, there's a million things you can do to get yourself in the mood. And back to those ideas we have about women, that women always want connection. Like not every woman wants cuddling or back rub. Some women want to be picked up and tossed on the bed.
Yep.
So giving women permission to do whatever it is that lets them access their desire is so important.
And having them feel comfortable to tell their spouse, I actually want you to manhandle me a little bit. Okay.
I love that term. I'm going to put that down for I love that.
Get the wrestling.
Yes,
on.
Exactly. We're going to do some mud wrestling. Yes.
So as you've taught women kind of about these different response cycles, and they've really come to understand their own about deciding, about finding what helps them feel aroused to then feel desire, what have you seen change in their relationships and their lives?
Oh, I think it makes sex so less fraught and so less heavy. You're not waiting for that pixie dust. So you start thinking about what it is that really turns you on. And you start introducing part B of that is a little bit what you and I were just talking about now, which is giving yourself permission to accept the things that turn you on. Because I feel like often women, they like to edit themselves. Like certain things aren't PC, like manhandle.
Yeah.
Some women might say, oh my God, that's so not feminist.
It's too vulnerable too, to be like, oh, I'm not as feminine as I quote unquote should be.
It's so interesting. One of the things that's fascinating to me is when I speak to older women in their late 40s or 50s, and we'll talk about trying new things. And women will say, there's no way that I could tell my husband of 20 years or 25 years that I want him to tie me up. He's going to be like, who are you? Like, how did you?
Who did I marry?
But I feel like, first of all, that goes back to like, if it makes you nervous, go for it. You're on the right track. The other thing about it is really this idea that if you can own what turns you on at any given moment. Yes, when you were 18 years old, maybe rose petals on your bed did it for you. And maybe when you're 22, getting tied up does it for you. And maybe when you're 25, having him climb into the shower without your knowing or something, you know what I mean? Being able to own what truly turns you on. When people realize that their desire is really in their control, it is such a huge relief. And it also feels like there's the same way that magic pixie dust is not going to fall on them. There's no magic formula. Like we didn't quite get it right because my desire isn't flying in. No, you decide what's going to turn you on today. And you get to sort of try different things and see what works. And it just takes sort of that magic. I don't know about, again, your culture, but I know that one of the things I often am fighting against is this idea that sex should always be holy. And I feel like it is holy. Like one of the things I've talked about in my podcast is that it's holy because it's within a consecrated relationship. That's what makes it holy, not because you're staring deeply into each other's eyes and the clouds part and the sun comes through. But there is this feeling like this sex is so fraught and not fun. And I feel like when you start realizing that it's more in your control than you think, and you have this wide range of ability to just to have fun with it, it takes the heaviness out of it and it just makes it fun, more fun.
Yes. And like you said, you were talking about over a lifetime, it changes. There's so many different kinds of sex. There is the maybe cloud parting, super somber sex. And then there's still very vulnerable and connecting, but fun and flirtatious and manhandling,
yes,
whatever,
totally.
And I think dipping into that vulnerability of being able to express what you want to be aroused, whether it's the more quiet moment or the more flirtatious fun, that makes it holy to me, even in these different kinds, because you're really showing up in the way you want, in how you're feeling, what you need.
You're really connecting.
Yeah.
The vulnerability that you describe is really allowing there to be two human connections. I talk a lot about the fact that when sex is missing in a relationship, it's not that a relationship can't sustain itself. It's just that what it's missing is sex is the only time when you really get naked with somebody. And I don't mean naked, just physically naked, but emotionally, you're really exposing who you are in a way that not sharing that with anybody else. So it's really important. And I do feel that when women start understanding that some of these myths are just myths, it just takes this huge burden off of them.
Yeah. And I feel like when we get into those routines and maybe like, this is how I had sex at the beginning of my marriage, so that's how I've done it. I think a lot of it comes back to the vulnerability, the fear of showing who you really are. How can women, if they're in that place and they're like, okay, this sounds great, and maybe understand a little more, but I have no idea what arouses me and I'm too scared to even try anything and dip into that vulnerability. What are some tips that you would give them?
The first thing I would say is what I said before, which is if something is scary, don't run away from it. That's a good sign that there's something there that you want to explore, and find the way in that feels less scary. And there are professionals out there. Like, that's what we do. We talk to people to try to help them find their way back in. And then if you're scared about communicating with your partner, there's so many ways. You can write them a letter. You can send them an email. You can whisper at the nighttime what you want. You can sit down and have a conversation and say, listen, can we just talk about our sex life because I'm embarrassed? I often find that having the meta conversation really eases your way into the conversation. So if a conversation starts by saying, listen, I've been thinking about our sex life. I love you. Our sex life is pretty good, but I want to make it better or more interesting. Is it okay if we talk about it? Often clears the path. And the last thing I would say on this is that you can do it. You're listening to this. It could be scary, but you totally can do this. I promise you, many, many women before you have been scared and nervous, and finding the things that turn you on for today. You're going to get past it. You're going to feel so good about yourself. You're going to express what you need. You're going to find it, and you're going to keep doing your sex life. And then in 6 years, you're going to be like, oh, I need to have this conversation again. I'm petrified. It's not static. It just keeps shifting. So think of it as something that you practice. Being able to be in touch with your sexuality, it's going to make you feel really good. And, it'll sustain you for a while. And then you're going to need to maybe do it again.
And I love that idea of the meta conversation, because I think just opening up that vulnerability a little bit, test the waters, and then you can see, like, was that a safe space? Was I accepted? If yes, you can go a little deeper. If not, then maybe keep working on that meta conversation for a little bit, or get some help if there are some issues where that vulnerability isn't able to flow. And I love to, like, this is a lifelong thing. And it is so sad to me that so many of us are just like, oh, that's how sex is. And it's like, do sports people stop practicing basketball? They're professionals. Do they stop? Like, no, it changes and grows. And those conversations need to stay open throughout our whole life.
Right. And those basketball people, I assume that when they injure their elbow, they need to learn how to take a shot in a slightly different way. Yeah. And I do think that it's like practicing anything. The more you talk about it, the easier it gets to talk about it, and the more fun.
Yes. How would you suggest then that couples with these different cycles, and this podcast mainly talks to women, I hope guys listen to, but what are some ways that women can maybe start to bring this up with their spouse and be like, hey, I learned about these different cycles. What are some things you would suggest that they can do to kind of work together as they learn what each of their cycles is like?
I think conversations they're always this sort of starting ground, the conversations of, this is what I'm learning. How does this speak to you? Does that shift the way you think about me and sex with me? Does that make you feel bad? It could be that somebody's husband will be like, what? You mean you don't spontaneously want to have
sex?
You
have to decide.
Right. That goes back to when I'm talking to couples about scheduling sex. There's this feeling like I've taken the romance out of it.
So unromantic.
Exactly. But usually if you talk about the sex then being better or more frequent, it makes people understand. And I think, again, going back to the fact that I feel like men get a really bad rap, I feel like my experience is that people's husbands want there to be good sex, not just for them. They want their wives to be happy. There's nothing as hot as a turned on wife. It's way more fun to have sex with somebody else who really wants to be there with you having sex than it is to have somebody who's just going through the motions. I think people are really open to this conversation. I talk a lot about vibrators because I did my dissertation on vibrators.
Oh, I love it.
And, women will be like, I don't know how to bring it up with my husband. So much of it has to do with the women's own feeling about it, because the husbands are usually super happy to introduce the vibrator. Like, sometimes it takes a little getting used to, like they need to understand how to use them and when to use them. But most of the husbands are my experience are very open to this idea that women's response cycle may be a little bit different than the men's response cycle, and that it doesn't make it worse or better. It's just different. And they have to kind of work in that way. And here are some of the things that turn me on. You said it so well. Oh, you want to have sex? Sure. I'm happy to have sex. You need to just give me some time to get me there. That feels very different to a husband than somebody being like, oh, I can't believe you want to have sex again. Like, that just feels totally different.
Yes. And with the vibrators too, I think I've heard some husbands are scared of like, oh, I'm being replaced. But just to have those conversations of, no, this is a tool I want to use so that we can connect better and we can enjoy our time together more. This isn't a replacement.
I have to tell you that my experience is that it's usually the woman who's more worried about the husband feeling replaced. Often, if you're not using an internal vibrator, you're using an external vibrator. And once he sees how much easier or better the orgasms are, like, honestly, I always joke around, like, for the men, their mouths and their hands get really tired. Like, for them, it's like,
they got a little finger workout.
They love watching the women they're with getting super turned on and having orgasms. So again, that's a perfect example of time after time after time. I've seen women who thought they couldn't introduce vibrators into the relationship be able to do that. And I tell this story. I think I have the story in my book as well, but I had this woman who was, I don't know, 53 or something, who was a client who came in, who'd been married for probably 30 years and wasn't having orgasms and was pretending to have them. This wasn't isolated, but this is a great story. And so we worked with her for a while. We gave her a vibrator. She started having orgasms and she's like, I can never use it with my husband because there's no way I could ever tell him that I had been faking orgasms all those years. We strategized different ways that maybe she could, but she was like, there's no way. But 3 appointments in, she came walking in and she was laughing. And she said, I finally told him. And she said, he didn't speak to me for 2 days. And then on the 3rd day, I'm in the bedroom and he comes in and he says to me, okay, let me see it. And she's like, let me see what? She didn't even know what he was talking about at that point. It was 3 days later. So I pulled it out. She said, we have been having the best time ever in our sex life. She's 53 years old, like the best time ever. It just made me happy because I feel like people want their partners to be happy. And that was an extreme case. This was a 53-year-old man, very traditional. I could see why he was a little bit miffed. And so the not talking for 2 days was probably not fun. But in the end, he came around and he was so happy to make her happy.
And I found that too. I feel like most husbands are on board to make their wife happy and they want to pleasure her, but we have so many barriers that keep us from opening up and allowing ourselves to be pleasured.
It's that vulnerability issue again that you're raising, which I think is so key.
I agree. With desire, there's a desire discrepancy, like we've been talking about, just because of the different response cycles. We experience desire differently. And so what would you say to couples to start to work through this? Because I think it can be hard. The examples we've given, I think, can be so helpful, but it can be a hard transition to realize, oh, my person doesn't want to have sex just spontaneously, or they want to have sex spontaneously and it takes me so much work to get there.
I often will start with couples scheduling the sex. And here's where I probably differ from a lot of other sex therapists. I actually schedule the not sex as well, because when a woman comes in and she's at that 3 level, like she kind of is avoidant already, she really doesn't want to have sex. Often she's walking around with this clock in her head. Like it's been 5 days since we had sex. It's been a week. It's been 2 weeks, always feeling bad about the fact that she's not having sex. She feels like he wants sex constantly. And the husband is usually feeling like, we're never going to have sex again. And I don't know what to do. Like when I ask her, she gets annoyed. When I leave it alone, hoping it'll happen by itself, she never approaches me. Like I'm never going to have sex again. And so he's usually very despondent. She's feeling super put upon. And so what I'll often do in that situation is work with couples where they pick a specific, and I really do talk about this a lot in my book. They pick a specific time to have sex. Let's say, I don't know, Sunday night or Friday night. And then the rest of the time, no matter what happens, sex is off the table. That allows both of them. It allows him to sort of know, okay, I will have sex. I'm not never having sex again. And she can get herself ready. And that's often a good way for a couple to find their way back to each other, whether you do it once a week or twice a week. She can find her way back to him. She can get herself ready to have sex. And she doesn't walk around with that clock in her head all the time feeling guilty. I find that that's a really, really, for couples who've kind of really gotten into a bad pattern. For couples who are not in a bad pattern, who just need to have the conversations, I feel like the conversations are not, it just takes some processing on both ends and a little bit of give and take, but that's true about anything in a marriage and a relationship.
Yes. And
right?
like you said at the beginning, like the longer it's been since you've had sex, it can be harder to get back into it. But that cycle goes like when you're having sex regularly, it's going to be easier. And for goodness sake, I don't want it to just be easier. I want you to want it because it's fun and it's connecting. And
yes. Well, it's easier to want it. I think what you want to say is it gets easier to want it.
Yes.
You don't make it easier to have to do it, but it gets easier to want it because that's what we want in the end. We want to be.
That's what we want.
We want, right. We want to be wanted and we want to want. Yes. I think that that's true.
And that's why we're doing what we're doing. It's not about, it's like we want women to enjoy sex because it can transform yourself and your relationship. I feel like it can make us so much more full women when we can accept our sexuality and express it. And as women are listening and they're like, okay, I want to start to understand my own sexual response cycle and my partner's, can you just kind of summarize a good place for them to start?
I think after listening to this podcast, I hope you stop and you say to yourself, I'm going to take some quiet space and try to figure out, do I spontaneously want sex? Do I not spontaneously want sex? How do I get myself in the mood? What's the most effective way to get in the mood? And how do I communicate that to my partner so he kind of understands what's going on with me? And let me understand his response, because we are always making this assumption that men are functioning that way. And I often have women call me who are like, my husband never seems to want to have sex, which is devastating to many women. So sort of taking the time to think about your own response cycle, understand it a little bit better, think about your partners, talk to your partner a little bit about it, sort of explore these things together. I feel like that's like, I'm learning this. What do you think? Does this make sense to you? Does this feel like it resonates with you? Maybe you're feeling pressure too, husband. Like maybe you're feeling a pressure that you somehow have to be constantly wanting to have sex and you don't constantly want to have sex. So have that conversation, take the time to figure it out. And most importantly, be kind with yourself. Changes take time and understanding yourself takes time. And there's always professionals for you to work with if you feel like you're getting a little stuck. And that doesn't mean years and years of therapy. It just means checking in with somebody a little bit.
Yeah, having someone who has the experience to kind of help push you through the hard times and coach you through. And I'm really glad you talked about too, because there are, of course, men and women who are opposite of what we think. There are women who are more spontaneous and men who are more having to decide to get in the mood. And I think that when it's the opposite, like you mentioned, those women who are like, my husband never wants to have sex, we feel so broken, I think, on both sides. The person who may feel spontaneous, even though they should be responsive, should in quotes, and their partner, like, I think we just feel so broken when we don't fit into the norms that we expect we should.
When I see those couples, that is really heart-wrenching, because when a woman seems to not want to have sex, it's terrible that we've sort of built that in society. Society thinks, okay, well, that's classic.
Yeah.
So the guy feels like, well, she doesn't want to have sex, but that's, I guess, a woman. When a guy doesn't want to have sex, the woman feels like
something's wrong with me.
Exactly. Now, the guys also feel like something's wrong with them when their wives don't want to have sex with them, but not nearly to that. Because we live in a society where basically men are told they should be wanting to have sex all the time with anybody. It's ridiculous. It's also, these are terrible messages. So yes, I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind as well.
Yes. Thank you so much. This has been great. Where can we find you? And I'll link your book to tell us the title of your book.
The book is Sex Points, Reclaim Your Sex Life with the Revolutionary Multi-Point System. It's called Sex Points. I am on Instagram at Dr. Batsheva, DrBatsheva, or TikTok at the Dr. Batsheva. And my website's Dr. Batsheva. And it was so much fun being on here with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. It was awesome. I hope that you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Sheva Marcus. It was so great to learn more about Rosemary Basson's research about women's sexual response cycle, especially as we find it in committed relationships, that often the sexual response can start with a choice. And I think for a while, when I would think about this, it didn't feel as romantic, right? But I feel like I've been able to get to a better place where making that choice to be intimate has become more natural for me. That even if I'm not feeling desire, I can recognize I want to be close to my partner. And so I want to let him know that I would love to be intimate, and then being able to figure out what is going to help move me into the mood and get me to a space so that I can feel aroused and then feel desire, and then have the desire and arousal build on each other. And I also loved how Dr. Batsheva talked about this is a lifelong process. It's not something that we learn once and then we're going to have sex the same throughout our whole entire life. And I loved the example she gave of, like, if a basketball player hurt their arm, they're probably going to learn how to shoot the ball differently. And I've definitely found that as I've had kids and as my body has aged, things are different, and that's okay. It can be frustrating at times to have to go back and figure out what is going to work now. But I think that that's a really important part of our relationships, that it's a space for it to grow and develop because it's not stagnant. And one last thing that I want to point out that I just loved was her discussion about leaning into discomfort. Discomfort is not a pleasant feeling. And so I think that a lot of times we avoid it because it's uncomfortable, but leaning into the discomfort, whether that be talking about something that you and your partner disagree on, and being able to lean into that conflict and discuss it without maybe getting super angry or yelling, but being able to discuss it in a constructive way can be uncomfortable. But in those moments of discomfort, I really believe that's where the growth in relationships comes. And then looking at it with our sex life, that discomfort is what is going to help bring in more of the ability to be aroused and to have desire because it's unknown and it's uncomfortable. And I loved that idea of just, you're on the right track if you're feeling uncomfortable about something. So I hope this week that you can lean a little bit more into that discomfort, that you can find a space of safety in the discomfort that allows you to dig in and discover more within that discomfort. If you'd like some help coming up with questions to ask your spouse, or you just need help getting the conversation started, don't forget to download my freebie that is listed in the show notes, 10 questions to ask your spouse about sex. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and thanks for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, and our miscellaneous task was Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.